One of the most powerful tools that can help us in our compositing is Camera Raw. And it doesn't matter whether you have a Nikon file or a Canon file or a JPEG or a TIFF, all of these can be opened in Camera Raw. And one of the things we can do to make our life even simpler is create a nice two-way street between Camera Raw and Photoshop, which doesn't happen by default. So let's take this one just as an example. When I double click on it, because it's in Canon RAW format, it opens up in Camera Raw. And here's the way it was shot. It's a little bright. I could certainly do things like crop it to get out the extra information I don't need, because all I really need is this area here. But here's what happens by default. If let's just open that, it'll take it into Photoshop and it'll open it. Problem is, that's kind of like that's the end of our journey, because at this point this is now in Photoshop and there's no relationship whatsoever back to Camera Raw. So if I decided actually I need to change the exposure, really at this point my only option would be to close it and start over again. So one of the things that we can do in Camera Raw, and it's a very important setting, and personally I keep this on all the time, is right down here at the bottom where it has what looks just like information. This is where we can choose things like how big a file do we want and all that kind of stuff. But a very important checkbox right here, open in Photoshop as smart objects. Now, the reason it's worded that way is it means it's almost like it's saying from now on, open every Camera Raw file into Photoshop as this thing called a smart object. And let's see what that really means. For now, I'm going to deliberately make a bad choice and overexpose something to the point where it's just not looking very good at all. Now you notice the button says Open Object. So as before, it still comes into Photoshop, but with one very important difference, and that is it's a subtle one at first, but this symbol right here simply means that this is now this thing called a Camera Raw Smart Object. And that means if I double click on it, it goes right back to Camera Raw, and now I can adjust it however I want. So one of the ways that we can use this as an example in our world of compositing is to deliberately change the exposure. Like here, I don't really want her to be that dark, but it's making a better separation between her and the white background. So with that in mind, I'm going to click OK. So what I'm really doing is temporarily adjusting to make it easier to see what I'm doing. So for example, I'll just do a real quick one here, not worry too much about accuracy, but if I take the quick selection tool, you can see it's having no problem distinguishing the edge. I won't worry about selecting the rest for now, because the point is once you've got a selection, now if I double click and go back and say, all right, let's put it back to the default settings and maybe just a little darker and a little more contrast. When I click OK, it updates in Photoshop but preserves the selection I've already made. So you see how it gave the quick selection tool a better chance of making a selection. The process is exactly the same no matter what you're doing. Here's a Nikon RAW file. I can double click on that and do the same thing. So, all right, I want to adjust the exposure to make it easier to distinguish between her shoulder and the background, or hair in the background. Hit Open Object, and as before, do the same thing, make my selection. And we'll talk more about this in full detail, but this is really the point, is from now on, every time you do this, you have the ability to go, all right, well, now that I've got my selection, let's play around with the exposure. I want this to be a darker kind of look. Click OK, and it will update while preserving my selection. Same rule applies with a JPEG or a TIFF, with only one difference, and that is if I double click on this file, it'll just open in Photoshop, period, as a JPEG. What I need to do is either press Command or Control R, that's the keyboard shortcut for Open in RAW, and when I do that, now the same rule applies. When I hit Open Object, it will open in Photoshop. Technically, it still started out life as a JPEG, but now it has that same built-in ability to go back and forth into Camera Raw and make some changes. So just remember, you have to do this once. Personally, I leave it on all the time. All I ever do is sometimes maybe change the size or something, but I leave this checkbox on all the time. As long as that checkbox is on, and like I said, I leave it on, it's going to say Open Object on this button all the time. If for some reason you wanted to override that, holding down the Shift key changes it to Open Image, which means there's no longer a connection between Camera Raw and Photoshop. To me, I usually leave it on Open Object just because it gives me that ongoing background. The one thing that you will find, and we'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about things like painting and so on, is when you have a smart object like this and you attempt to do anything like painting or cloning, you get this symbol, which I like to call the "I'm sorry, Dave, I can't let you do that" symbol, which just means you can't work directly on a smart object. So you'd have to do things on a separate layer, which frankly I would do anyway. It's completely up to you, of course, but I really suggest exploring this Camera Raw Smart Object capability because it really has a nice back and forth ability for you to over adjust, under adjust, make your selection, and then put it back the way you want.